I was born in the Netherlands and I grew up there. And I was very interested in animals as a child. Uh, since I was in the Netherlands, it was mostly aquatic animals like salamanders and fish and sometimes birds. Um, at some point, I became a student in biology, so that's much later, and I was disappointed because biology at the time was already very molecular. They called it biochemistry at the time. And so I didn't see any live animals. Basically, I was cutting up animals and studying biochemistry and plant systematics and so on. But then later I discovered animal behavior, and I went to a different university where they were specialized in that. And so that's how I came into the study of animal behavior. World War II had a big effect on the study of animal behavior, strangely enough, because Hitler had used biology. Actually, those ideas of eugenics, they came out of America and England. So they didn't come from Germany, but he was using that. And so biology got a bad reputation as a result, especially if it relates to races and human genetics. So it had a very bad reputation until the 80s. And in addition, in animal behavior, the focus became aggression. And for example, Konrad Lorenz in Germany, he wrote a book on aggression, saying that aggression is a natural instinct of the human species. Many people saw that as him trying to whitewash what had happened during World War II. So it became very ideological, that whole discussion, and very heated. And everyone was studying at that time violence and aggression. That was basically all we could study in animals. So you couldn't get money to do, for example, cognition was not really an issue. So it was all on violence and aggression. And I was a student in that time. So I was very affected by that. Not so much my worldview, but very affected by how that impacted science. My own worldview was probably also affected by it. I'm from a country where consensus is an important, tolerance and consensus is an important issue. And so I'm now living in a more individualistic or capitalistic country, so to speak. And so I bring, in that sense, a different cultural perspective, I think, to the study of animal behavior. The European ethologist, I'm sort of an indirect descendant of Tinbergen, who was the Dutch ethologist. You know, Tinbergen and Lorenz, they both got Nobel Prizes for ethology in the 70s. And the ethological school is biologists who are trained to observe animals in the field, or at least under naturalistic conditions. And so they're very focused on what is the behavior of this species under what kind of circumstances, what are the evolutionary advantages of this behavior or this cognition or whatever. So it's a very evolutionary perspective. And in the US, the perspective on animal behavior comes out of psychology mostly. It's mostly what we used to call behaviorists. They're sort of dying breed now, but they did exist. And they had this view that the better you control your animals, you put them in a little box, give them a lever to press, and you do it with pigeons and rats. You don't need to do a lot of other species because learning basically is universal for all animals, is all the same in all animals. And so sometimes the extreme behaviorists, they would say, why would you study apes? Why take the trouble to study chimpanzees if you can basically study all the learning processes in a pigeon or in a rat? And so that's a very different perspective. And so I'm much more focused on observing behavior and sort of categorizing it and wondering about what it is good for and so on, than the behaviorists who are more in controlling the animal and let them do something. And the behaviorists would even call, if animals did different things in the Skinner box than they were supposed to, they would call it misbehavior. They were not happy if their pigeons did something else than what they were expected to do. Well, I had a brief contact with chimpanzees, strangely enough, in my earlier university, where I had a period of time, like 3 months or 4 months, where I was looking for a job, and I took a job in a psych department where they had 2 chimpanzees. It was very unusual, of course. Nowadays, no one would have 2 chimpanzees just in a psych department, but they had that. They were 2 juveniles. And I very much enjoyed working with them. I was very impressed by their intelligence. People would say, well, they're as smart as a dog. Well, they're 10 times smarter than a dog, I would say. And so I was very impressed by that, and I enjoyed the contact, and I enjoyed the primates. Then later I went to a different university where I worked with rats and with birds and all sorts of things. And then a job came along to work with primates. And since I had that previous contact, which was so positive, I jumped on that and took that job. I was not trained in the Skinnerian view, and I'm very happy with that. And because I think it was an indoctrination that was going on here in the US. In the Netherlands, that indoctrination didn't exist. In some quarters it did, like in psychology departments, but not in biology. And so what happened here in the US is that everyone who thought outside of that box, even serious scientists like, let's say, Edward Tolman or Robert Yerkes, they thought outside of the behaviorist box and they got slammed for it. They were not taken seriously. They had to publish in second-tier journals because they couldn't get their papers in the first-rate journals. And so I never faced that kind of pressure that existed in the US. And I often encounter people here, even though it's usually the older generation now who still thinks like that. It's not the younger generation anymore. But I still encounter people here who are very sort of rigid in what they accept in terms of animal behavior and animal cognition. Yeah, I was actually initially only interested in animal behavior. I was not particularly on human behavior. And I think I would have been perfectly happy working with fish or with birds, even though I sometimes say that I prefer intelligent animals, and maybe you wouldn't think of fish necessarily in that case. But I ended up in the primates, and with the primates, the comparison with humans is so easy and so obvious, because we are primates, that when I started writing popular books, that became my focus. Now, many people write popular books like Lawrence. He worked with geese and with fish. Edward Wilson works with ants. You can be a very good popular writer in the natural sciences without working with primates. I mean, it's not a requirement. But since I worked with the primates, the comparisons came very easily to me. At the zoo where I worked in Holland, in order to repay them for their services, I said, well, I'll take a group of visitors every week or every 2 weeks, if you have one, and I'll talk to them. So I talked to a group of housewives or a group of lawyers or a group of bakers. All these groups come to a zoo. And I very quickly noticed what are the sort of things that they're interested in animals. And there's a lot of things that we worry about in our field that they don't care about at all. So the bigger theories they don't necessarily want to hear about, certainly not the controversies that we have. So I got interested in talking to a general public, and I noticed how excited they are by that. And so that I sort of translated that in the writing of my books. And there are too few scientists who do that, I feel. So there are many science journalists, and they're excellent, who write in blogs and newspapers, and they write books also. And that's great, but it's not the same as when scientists themselves, who are a bit more precise and avoid certain issues, like, for example, you may say that animals think, but I really don't know what they think. And actually that's not the goal of our field. Our goal is to propose certain ideas about their mental complexity and then test those ideas. And what exactly they think or feel is not really accessible to us. And so we are less sloppy in how we talk about these things than many science journalists are. And so I feel it's important that the scientists also write. And of course, there are, of course, many who do so, but not enough, I think. In the early 80s, there were very few jobs for PhDs in the Netherlands. Actually, we're sort of back to that moment. And in the US, we're back to that moment that there were few jobs. And so anything you could get would be great. But for me, it was a bit scary to move to another country. I'd never been to the US. And I got this invitation out of the blue. I gave a little talk at a conference of, one of those 12-minute talks, and the director of the Wisconsin Primate Center came to me after the talk. He said, "I want you to work with me," and so that's how it came about. And initially, since I wasn't sure that I wanted to live in the U.S., I said I'll come for 1 year. But very soon he offered me a permanent position, and very soon it became more than that. Yeah. There was a lot of support for research, more than in Europe. In Europe, everything was organized at that time. That's changing a bit, but at that time it was all organized through a professor. The professor got money from the university. The professor would appoint people, usually for their lifetime, working with him. So it was a very rigid system and a very sort of based on friendship type or mentorship type situation. Whereas in the US it was much more open, and even if you didn't have the right connections but you had the right proposal, you might be able to get money. And so it was a very different kind of system. And so I was very pleased with that. Initially, when I came, grant writing was not even a big issue. I got an assistant and I got a salary. And when I asked Bob Goy, who was the director at the Primate Center, should I write a grant? He said, no, why would you write a grant? He wasn't even eager for me to write a grant. It was sort of a waste of time. Of course, later this completely changed. Now you would be pressured to write your grants. But at the time, it was like an option. And at some point I did that, and at some point I got funding from the outside. In Wisconsin, for most of the time, I did still observations. And so I watched monkeys at the zoo. We had large groups of like 60, 70 monkeys per group. I did do very little experimentation, and it's only towards the end of my time there, which I stayed there for 10 years, that I said, well, I need to start experimenting on the issues that I'm interested in. And so I did one experiment on young macaques, and I got a group of capuchin monkeys that were intended to work experimentally on. My experiments are always non-invasive, so I was not very eager to do, let's say, brain research on them. But I would set up, let's say, food sharing studies or cooperation studies on them. And so by the end of those 10 years, I started doing that. And so when I moved to Emory in Atlanta, that was my goal, is to become much more experimental. So I moved from being an observational scientist to an experimental one. The first book was Chimpanzee Politics, which I wrote because I spent 6 years at the Arnhem Zoo, and in those 6 years there was a big power struggle among the males. And they had a lot of cognitive components, because it was clearly very smart strategies that they were following. It had a lot of emotional components, because I got interested in conflict resolution and reconciliation, how they reconciled after fights. It had a very dramatic component, because at some point one of the males got killed by two other males, and I was very affected by that. And so all these elements were there, and so I decided to write Chimpanzee Politics. I was not really in the book comparing it with human politics, but I think the comparisons were so obvious that I didn't need to explain what the similarities were. These males were very power driven, and they formed coalitions and they made deals with each other. And so I started to write that. And when I wrote that, it was sort of risky, because I was implying a lot of processes like reciprocity and strategies and future orientation and so on. And also the power drive, basically, that people were sort of reluctant about. And so my advisor, my professor, he was very concerned with this book. So, like, I had written scientific articles, that was all fine, but in this book I was going beyond that, and he was worried that it would be damaging to my career, I suppose. But when the book came out, it was interesting. My peers, other primatologists, they had no trouble with it at all, and the larger society also very little complaints about it. And I think it was basically the time was ripe for a book that put social behavior in a cognitive context, and later this became sort of the rule. People started doing that more and more, and so I actually got very little criticism, even though I had expected that. Yeah. The empathy part I had already discovered in the Arnhem Zoo. The chimpanzees console each other after fights. And so that a chimpanzee who is distressed doesn't need to be a fight, it can also be distressed because it didn't get food that it was begging for, or something like that. Or an infant may be being weaned and is distressed as a result. But when chimps are distressed, others come over and embrace them and calm them down. And I had described that behavior, but I had never connected it with empathy. And so one time I went to a meeting of child psychologists who said, this is how we study empathy. And so they explained, we go to a family, we ask mom to cry, and then we see how the children respond to mom. And young children will come over and touch her and stroke her and look at her, and that's an act of empathy. I said, well, if that's empathy, then I see lots of empathy in my animals. And so that's how I started making the connection. And so since I was already working on conflict resolution and reconciliation, then empathy was added to it. And then later I began to speculate about morality, because clearly it's very hard to talk about human morality without implying empathy. And so all these things started to sort of connect. And then I started testing things out more specifically. The fairness studies were not part of that project. They came about sort of independently, but clearly fairness and justice are also parts of human morality. And so all of that sort of tied together. And so for some people, morality belongs in the religious domain and doesn't belong in the natural sciences. But I've found that many people are quite open to it. Even many religious people are quite open to making the connections between, let's say, animal nature and human nature and morality. The resistance is not nearly as great anymore as it used to be, I would say. I remain very Dutch in my outlook, I would think. And so there's a lot of things in this country that I had to get used to, even though it's sort of interesting. When I came to this country, euthanasia we had that in Holland. We had gay marriage in Holland. We had legalized drugs in Holland. And when I came here, those things were so absolutely taboo. And now all that discussion is going on, and there are certain states that have legalized drugs. Gay marriage is spreading. Basically, I would never have predicted that. And so I see a lot of change in this country that I was actually already used to in the Netherlands. And there's many things that for me have been very positive experiences in this country, in the sense that I always feel that in the US, if you're successful, that's more rewarded than in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a very egalitarian, homogeneous type country, even though that's changing at the moment. But if you're too successful, that's sort of held against you almost. Like, we don't want you to be different from us, you know. And I always feel that in the US, if you're successful, your colleagues will congratulate you and they're happy for you. At least they seem happy for you. They're not always, but I think most of the time it is rewarded and it's appreciated. So that's a very different feeling than you sometimes get in the Netherlands. I think my research on social integration, so to speak, because I basically study mechanisms of how animals connect with each other and how they relate to each other, and how they can cooperate, and even though they're competitive at the same time. That relates sort of to my Dutch background, I think, because I'm very interested in that kind of social integration. Maybe more so than many Americans, who immediately assume that individual benefits and individual selfishness sort of drives everything, which is really not how I look at a society. So I think that's the Dutch background. And the American influence I'm not sure that has influenced very much my outlook, but it has maybe influenced the way I work, is that you're allowed to be ambitious here, and so I am ambitious. So I think that's a different way of looking at things. Yeah. The biggest change, I think, was when I moved from being an observer to being an experimentalist, which is what happened when I moved to Atlanta. And from then on, we still kept doing observational studies, but I increasingly started testing capuchin monkeys and chimpanzees, and presenting them with very specific problems to get at the specifics of the cognition that's behind their behavior, which is really not something you can do as observational studies. And so I usually compare it. You can watch a bunch of kids in the schoolyard. You would never guess that they are very smart. All you see is a bunch of screaming kids running around. It's only when you bring them to a table and give them a test that you can see how smart they are. And the same is true for the primates. If you look at chimpanzees running around screaming at each other and having a big fight, yes, the good observer can detect certain cognitive mechanisms going on, but really to get a handle on them, you need to bring the chimps in and present them with a particular situation, preferably one that they haven't seen before, and see how they do under those conditions. And so that was maybe my biggest change. And then in my writing, I've been writing popular books for such a long time. I don't think my writing, of course, has improved because I write in English, and my English has improved. So my writing may have improved, but the basic message is, I think, still the same. At the moment, we're still working on cooperation. So I work on cooperation, and I have a postdoc who works on gambling, so risk-taking, basically. We work on trust. which is a big issue in human economic relationships. So we do a lot of projects that in humans we would call behavioral economics, in the sense that we want to know how animals cooperate, why they cooperate, what are the benefits and the disadvantages of certain cooperation. So we're still working on that issue. Yeah, I'm writing at the moment a book about animal intelligence, and so I'm not just the primates. I'm looking at all sorts of species, from let's say the octopus to the elephant, and everything in between. And yeah, I think we have evolved in the last 100 years in a direction, evolved in the cultural sense. We have moved in a direction where anthropocentrism is less of an assumption, and so and people are open to that. That's the interesting thing. If 25 years ago you would say to people that, let's say, a chimpanzee has all these sort of cognitive capacities that we normally assume for humans, people would have been very resistant, and they would have echoed the behaviorist complaint, like, how do you know it's not learning? Or how do you know they haven't been rewarded for this or rewarded for that? But people are now very open to that, and outside the sciences, but also inside the sciences, very open to the idea that you don't need language to think ahead, for example. You don't need language to have specific memories. You don't need it to be self-aware, and so all this whole assumption that existed in psychology is that everything is sort of language-driven has disappeared. Language is wonderful to communicate about things, but that is not necessarily the stuff that makes you think about issues. And so this comes partly out of developmental psychology, who have found that very young children who don't have language yet can solve all sorts of cognitive problems, and the same is true in the animal studies. And so that's something that really intrigues me, is that we have become less anthropocentric in our culture, and I don't know how and why this came about. I'm sure it's not just driven by our research. Our research may be even a product of that, but that's certainly a trend that I see. I do think all these videos, they contribute to our view of animals, in the sense that if I tell you an anecdote of what my chimpanzee did under certain circumstances, it's not the same as when I show you a video. Because the video can be analyzed, everyone can see it, people have different opinions, can express that if they want. It makes the event more discussable and more testable, even though it's not really an experiment. But still, the video is more convincing, I think, than a story. And so we have moved from, because people would say that when I would tell stories about chimpanzees, that's just an anecdote. We have moved from that to, no, let me show you the video. And I can show them an actual video of. So that's a big step forward. Now, some of these videos that are on YouTube, they, and I have a popular Facebook site at the moment in which I sometimes show these videos. Some of these videos, they don't show what people think they show. That's a problem. Is that so? For example, recently there was a video where you see a dog who's sitting next to a dead fish, or at least a not very live fish, and is throwing water with his snout. He's throwing water from a pool of water onto the fish, and people send that to me and they say this is an altruistic dog because he's trying to keep the fish wet. Now, dogs usually cover smelly stuff. And so since anything that he has available is water, he's now covering it with water. If there had been a pile of dirt next to the fish, that's probably what he would have thrown on it. And so I look at that video and I see a dog covering a smelly object. Other people look at it and they see altruism. And so I'm often now in a situation, even though I promote the idea that animals are thinking beings and feeling beings, I'm often sort of put in the situation where I have to say, wait a second, I'm not sure that this is what you think it is. You know, for me, the big elephant in the room is not even research animals. The big elephant is agricultural animals for me, because those numbers are much bigger, and the suffering is much deeper. I think, in the sense that those are, let's say, cows and pigs and chickens. And well, it's not really addressed very vigorously at the moment, I would say, by the agricultural industry, which is very resistant. But in the general public, I can feel a shift in opinion about all of this. And people are becoming more sensitized to this. And so we have, of course, already reached the point that many people now buy eggs, buy chickens who have been running free, so to speak. And so people are sensitized to that, and I think that's going to continue. And at some point, I think the agricultural industry will have to respond, and they will probably see a profit in it, in the sense that if they respond well and they do it right, they may actually make more profit than people who don't follow that kind of thinking. Well, the ideal for me would be that we raise meat without a central nervous system. We're probably on the brink of doing that, is that we can have factories where we raise muscle tissue without the actual animals there, in petri dishes. And I think that's going to happen one day, and if once that happens, then the whole suffering issue is going to be resolved, I suppose. But let's just talk about the research animals. I think there is a change on the way. With the chimpanzees, for sure, we have seen that. The chimpanzees have been declared by NIH as not suitable anymore for invasive studies, even though maybe at some limited scale, but certainly not anymore what we used to do. And so this has happened with chimpanzees, and I would not be surprised if 20 years from now this happens with the monkeys. And who knows, this may at some point also happen with the rodents, but we take it sort of one at a time. But the scientists who think that the monkeys studies will continue exactly the way they are now, I think they are naive about what's happening. With the chimps, we have seen this coming for 25 years. This debate has been going on and on and on. And I know that some people didn't want to see that, but it was coming that invasive studies on chimpanzees would at some point need to stop. And that's the point we have now reached in this country, but also in some other places like in Japan and in Europe that has also been reached. Well, Living Links seeks to connect, that's why it's called Living Links instead of Missing Links. We have actually live links to human evolutionary past. By looking at chimpanzees and bonobos and some other apes, we can sort of reconstruct how our ancestors may have behaved, even though we don't have direct access to the missing links, which are the ancestors. So we look at behavior and cognition and genetics to see how humans connect with the living apes. And that's the Living Links Center. The Living Links Center is only a very small part. The Turkish Primate Center is a very big center with many primates and many scientists. So we are a small center within there. In my own research, I've never done invasive studies. And that's partly because I work with chimpanzees and I don't want to do invasive studies on chimpanzees. And I've always felt that there's so many questions that I can ask that I can resolve in other ways that I don't need to do that. The thing is that to do, for example, neuroscience on primates, we still need to follow invasive procedures. We haven't reached the point, because in humans you can do a non-invasive imaging study in a brain scanner, and you can get actually answers to certain questions. You put people in the scanner, you ask them a question about some cognitive problem, and you can see which parts of the brain are activated. We cannot do that with the primates because we need to knock them down to put them in the scanner, so we cannot ask them any questions. So that's very unfortunate. We have one person at Emory who's trying to do this with dogs now, and because a dog you can train to sit still. And if the dog can sit still for 2 minutes or 3 minutes in the scanner, and you can present it with a certain problem, either based on odors or visual pictures or whatever, you can actually get some brain scans from the dog. And so this is going to happen one day, and I think it's also probably going to happen with the primates, is that if we have smaller scanners, we can probably train a primate to put his head in something and look at a picture, and we can do non-invasive neuroscience. But I've always been a fan of non-invasive studies on the primates. I've never done anything invasive, and I do have colleagues who do sometimes invasive studies on them. And of course, when certain diseases come up, like AIDS or Ebola or whatever, at that point many people start talking about invasive studies on the primates. But there's a lot of interesting questions that you can ask without that, I think. Yeah, I've always worked with group-housed primates, and I would not want to work with single-housed primates, even though there are many places, also Yerkes, that has single-housed or pair-housed, which is a bit of a compromise. But I feel all the primate centers need to move to group housing. And these primates are social animals. They a single chimpanzee, well, chimpanzees are always socially housed, almost everywhere that I know. Single house chimpanzees, I don't, but a single house chimpanzee would not be a real chimpanzee in my opinion. And I would say the same thing about a monkey, about a macaque. They live normally in groups of up to 100. And so pair housing is not really a solution for the situation. I think they need to live in groups. And yes, if you house them in a group, you get certain problems. You get, for example, certain problems of aggression maybe going on. Or if there is a disease, all of them will get that disease. So yes, it has certain negatives, but I think they are greatly outweighed by the positives. Is that you basically have a natural enrichment going on, because by housing them socially, they have all these things going on in their group life that really interest them much more than any artificial object that you would give them. And so you're basically providing them with natural enrichment, and also the argument I usually make is that if you're interested in, let's say, immunology, many people are, you have more natural subjects because you have animals who are socially housed. We are developing drugs for humans who are socially living. So why would you even want to consider a single housed sort of solitary confinement individual as your testing subject? So I think also scientifically there's a lot of reasons why you would want to do this. Now, sometimes my colleagues will say, well, I need access every day to my monkey. I need to be able to do this or that on my monkey every day. And so single housing is more convenient. Yes, it's maybe more convenient, but with a little bit of training, if you have some technicians who can do animal training, it's really not that hard to get the monkey out every day and do a certain thing on them, or inspect them, or feed them something, or whatever you need to do. That's really not that difficult. Well, in chimpanzees, at IRCIS, we have several groups of these chimps, and usually 20 would be a good number, 15 is a good number. For monkeys, you can have much bigger groups. We have at the IRCIS field station groups of 100 monkeys. I would say at least 20 or something to have a group of monkeys. Yeah. All the existing primate centers, they need to move away from single housing and pair housing. They need to move to group housing. So instead of a room like this, for example, you can put maybe 30 single cages, all stainless steel. They all need to be cleaned every day. So that's an enormous amount of hosing and work that you do in order to have these 30 stainless steel. You could also remove all that caging and make this room in its entirety and available for 30 monkeys. You build some complex climbing structures and some escape routes and whatever, and you make a provision so that you can isolate them if that's necessary on a daily basis. And this whole room could be built that way, and the cleaning would be far easier than all the single caging, and the monkeys would be far happier, in my opinion. And so I think that would be a great improvement, and I think every place needs to move in that direction. Yeah, universities sometimes have in a building where people live, basically in the basement, they have a small number of monkeys sitting there. That's not really ideal. I think what we have at Yerkes, for example, like a field station, but you need a certain climate for that. And in Georgia we have that, but where you can keep animals outdoors, that's already much of an improvement, of course, over some basement situation. So yes, small housing conditions or suboptimal housing conditions, I don't think that's the way to go. And it's very hard, of course, for scientists who work at the university if they want to do, let's say, neuroscience on the macaque. They don't want to travel to another place to do that. They want to do that in their own building, but it's not really optimal for the animals. Well, when the Ebola crisis came along, I found that interesting. All of a sudden, people were talking about using primates to solve that issue. And there were no objections to that. But I think it's because there was so much pressure and so much fear at that moment. In the same way that, for example, macaques have been used to solve the polio crisis. And so there will be certain areas in medicine where people will not object, maybe, for the use of animals like macaques. Yeah, but for chimpanzees, we will never have the numbers. We're not breeding chimpanzees at the moment. So the population is really aging. I'm involved in Chimp Haven, which is a facility that receives sanctuary, sort of sanctuary for retired chimpanzees. And they're all getting older everywhere, and the population is getting smaller. If you really want to do a massive, let's say, vaccine study, you need 1,000 or more subjects. We don't have that anymore. So the chimps are not really suitable as a model for that anymore anyway. Chimp Haven celebrates very soon its 20th birthday. So Chimp Haven was founded at the time that this issue with chimpanzees, where NIH not supporting invasive studies, was not there yet, even though I think everyone saw that coming. But we received chimpanzees mostly from facilities, from research facilities. Sometimes we have pet chimps coming in, or abandoned pet chimps. But most of them come from facilities, and NIH supported this. So there are several of these primate sanctuaries, but this one is supported, is the official one of NIH that is supported by them. And in the meantime, we are getting increasingly also donations. So fundraising is increasingly active, and so we also get money from elsewhere. And we have an enormous piece of land in Louisiana that was donated to us. I think it's 200 acres. Where we can build very large outdoor enclosures. Just outside of, let's say, living in Africa for chimpanzees, which is ideal, of course, in the forest. Outside of that, I think Chimp Haven is the best place because we have very large islands, forested islands, on which we can release the chimpanzees, and the climate is such that most of the year they can be outdoors. With chimps, of course, they live 50 to 60. Sometimes 60 years old. And so when a chimp is not used in research anymore, and we cannot terminate chimpanzees, that's another difference with many species. So rats, if you don't use them anymore, they will be terminated. This will never happen with chimpanzees. I don't know what the situation is with monkeys, but monkeys don't live that long a time, so I think the situation is less pressing with them. The natural populations we're very pessimistic about. So for the apes, I rarely meet anyone optimistic about ape conservation. This is really going in the wrong direction. And it's not just climate change, it's also the palm oil industry and the bush meat hunting and Ebola. The disease of Ebola has also affected the ape populations. And so the natural populations are dwindling, and there may be some sanctuaries left in the future in which, let's say, bonobos survive or gorillas survive and so on in small populations. But it is really a very bleak situation at the moment. I'm not a field worker myself, but I usually support all the initiatives that are going on, even though many of us are pessimistic, because the bushmeat hunting has really had an impact. And now with the palm oil, especially in Indonesia, which has really affected the habitat of the orangutan. And the palm oil is coming to Africa, I understand, and so it's really not very good. I'm pleased in what I've done, but I got quite lately interested in elephants, which is something that I did the last 5-6 years. And sometimes I think maybe I should have included more species than just the primates. But even within the primates, I have many colleagues who specialize in, let's say, gorillas or specialized in bonobos, and even within the primates, I've done 5 or 6 species. It is very hard to do detailed and reliable and respectable work if you spread yourself too thin. And so maybe this is just the way it had to be, that I'm focused on the primates.